Well, good evening everyone. My name's Carl Schneider. I'm the editor of Farmers Weekly and I want to welcome you to tonight's Arable Horizons lecture. This is the second lecture in the series and the idea behind the series is really simple. The idea is to identify the 5 areas of science and technology that we think over the next 10 or 20 years are likely to have the biggest impact on farming in the UK. And in each of those areas, find a leading researcher who can talk not just about their own work, but about what's going on in the field and how that might change the way we farm over the next 10 to 20 years. Each of these lectures is given to an invited audience of farmers, researchers, and other leading figures from the world of agriculture, but it's also streamed live over the internet, and the recording of the session will be available immediately after the lecture this evening on the Farmers Weekly website and on the Farmers Weekly YouTube channel. And of course the results will be written up in Farmers Weekly in a couple of weeks' time. So I said this was the second in the series. Back in November we held the first one on plant genetics and breeding, and today our subject is soil science. Now surely for crop growers nothing is more fundamental than the soil in which we grow our crops. But actually, it's surprisingly how poorly, up till quite recently, we've understood the soil that we use. This is a fantastic location to hold tonight's lecture. Rothamsted Research is the world's oldest agricultural research centre. I think research has been going on here since 1843, and some of the experiments started back in those early days are still going on, long-term experiments still continuing today. I want to say a big thank you to Syngenta for supporting this whole series of lectures. It's an expensive operation putting these on and using all the technology and so on to broadcast it to the world. And I really want to thank Syngenta for showing a commitment to the future of farming in the UK by supporting these lectures. So tonight's lecturer, I'm delighted to say, is Professor Wilfred Otten. He's Professor of Soil Biophysics at Cranfield University. He did his degree and his PhD at Wageningen University in Holland, which is one of, if not the most renowned academic centres of agricultural excellence in the whole of Europe. Prior to joining Cranfield, he worked at Cambridge University in their Department of Plant Science, and more recently he was co-director of the Scottish Informatics, Mathematics, Biology and Statistics Centre at Abertay University in Dundee. And just this year, in fact this month, he became the president of the British Society of Soil Science. So I can't think of anyone better placed to give tonight's lecture. You may have noticed on the invitation that it says these are interactive lectures, so I just want to say something about the interactivity. Firstly, we're using a technology called Slido. So hopefully some of you have already been introduced to this. If you've not already done this, if you take out your mobile phone and go to www.sli.o, that's both the people here in the room and those of you watching on the internet at home, because this will work wherever you are, it works over the web. And once you've opened up that web page, you'll see it asks you for a code. So if you put in that code, there's a hashtag in a field already put in there, and you just put the code 7290 into that box, and then that should take you to the home page for tonight's event on Slido. And you'll see at the top of the page there are 2 buttons. One says polls and one says questions. So if on the questions button, at any point during tonight's lecture, you can submit a question, because after the lecture will last about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have a short break where we reset the stage, and then Professor Otten and I will come back on the stage and we'll have a question and answer session, and we'll be working through some of the questions that people have been submitting, both from here in the audience and from over the internet. We won't be able to get through all of them, but we'll try and get through as many as we can, and certainly some of the more interesting questions. Another piece of interactivity, you might have wondered why there are 2 skittles, very large skittles on the stage. These are actually microphone balls. If you've been to events like this before, you know sometimes it can take a bit of a time for the person with the microphone to get to people asking questions. So rather than wait for that, we're going to use these. These are indestructible, I'm told. We'll maybe test that tonight. So they have a microphone inside. This black dot is the microphone. So all you need to do is when someone throws it to you, catch it, and then hold it in front of your mouth with the microphone pointing towards you, and we should be able to hear you. I'll just do a quick demo. So Adam, I'm going to throw it to you. Can you just hold it?
Glad I caught it.
Thank you. Okay, so you got the idea. So we can just throw it around the room, so it should be a bit quicker than waiting for a microphone to reach us. And of course, the third element of interactivity is social media. So if you do use Twitter or other social media, please use the hashtag #Arable Horizons. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Wilfred Otten. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for Farmers Weekly and Syngenta for this opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity, but a great series of talks that are actually being put together on some very interesting topics. And the way of doing this in an interactive way is kind of new for me as well, so I'll be interesting to see how we're going to experience this. One of the things is that during the talk, a few questions will be put up in an interactive way for you to give some answers to. And my understanding was the first question will come up at the start of the talk, so I may, if somebody can put that question up. There we are. Okay, so if you can answer this question, then while I'll start talking in a moment. So the answer should come in. Okay, there you see the first answer is already in. So you can give the same answers as they come in. This will build up as a cloud. Some of the questions will come up as multiple choices, so they might be a bit easier to answer. But it will give some idea, and some of this in the results we may come back in the discussion and we'll revisit this. So erosion, climate change has already come up, degradation. It's good to see those. Matter, Runman, organic matter, okay, good. It's good to see those topics up there because I'll come down to those during my talk. I'll move on to the first section. So when I said in my talk, okay, I'll have to look over my shoulder because it's not moving on my laptop. So the first I'll have a brief introduction about where we are at the moment. It's a bit talking about where are we with our soils and why do we need to change, so what's the evidence for that. Then we'll move on to what are the ways of changing. I'll talk a bit about soil health. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment. So how do we improve soil health? Do we actually know what is working? So what's the current state of that in our knowledge? Then what innovations are around the corner to enhance that evidence base? And is there a way by which we can introduce a step change? So what completely new way of thinking? Sometimes the ways that we do our research and our farming and move forward and our innovations, we keep on moving in the same direction. Is there, for instance, now a time that we'll have to say, well, we need to completely rethink what we're doing and put it in another direction? So I'll put some choices for that to you. And then we'll reflect after that briefly on what will be different in the future. So I'll just have a couple of images in there. Really, it is hardly necessary anymore these days. The message couldn't be more clear about our soils being in trouble. What I put on the background here is an image of a huge cloud. This is actually soil. So this is a dust cloud that will come. And they still happen quite frequently in the US. They actually have a name now. They're called haboops. And although they're referred to as freak weather events, they're really freak soil events. They are a result of soil erosion and climate interactions, drought. They happened in particular in the 20s and the 30s in the US up to a level which was that extreme that it actually required some immediate action. So these clouds would occur. Millions of tons of soil will move across the coast in the US, and it would blacken the sky for more than a day and introduce diseases and problems with diseases that were occurring. So it prompted the US government to action to put in a soil conservation program to target it to resolve this issue. It was resolved to some extent, but not completely. You see it's still occurring. This is also the time where Roosevelt made his famous statement, which we cite so often, that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. So that's the start in the US about also the rise of soil science as a discipline in there in moving forward. So we've got quite a few of those statements. It's the source of our food, but we're degrading it at quite a rapid time, at quite rapid speed. We need to produce more food. And we all have our favorite quotes, our things that in particular in areas where it is moving and degrading more quicker, whereas in other areas, here, like we can destroy our soils very quickly, but it takes a phenomenal amount of time to break that again. I'm sure you've all seen many of those quotes. We seem to like and advertise the importance of soil with those hitters, just to make sure that we get some messages across. And we all have our favorite ones. I quite like this one, actually. So soil erosion is second only to population growth as the biggest environmental problem. Nevertheless, we don't really do anything about it. And the reason is not because who really cares about dirt? So why would we worry about this? So, well, we should worry about it. So I think when over these last years, with the International Year of Soils as well, it's clearer more and more to the general public about soils that they are important. Maybe not exactly how important, but it's no longer a forgotten area. And actually, when you look around, you see that all sort of areas, companies, research institutions try to emphasize the importance of soils and begin to get interested in it. But it isn't just our soils that are changing. Agriculture, of course, has changed in a phenomenal way. When we think back in the past, everybody would be working the land and we would be supporting a few people. These days, it's almost the other way around. So we've got about 1% that is really involved in farming and working the land, and they support the rest of the population. So arguably, one could say all the knowledge is in 1% of our population, and we are completely reliant on surviving on that 1%. Now, that 1% is supported by a lot of knowledge, which is acquired these days. So what happens in the opposite direction is, for instance, the number of publications or studies that are being reported is almost exponentially increasing. So at the moment, when we look at scientific papers or studies related to soil science, there are more than 40,000 published each year. So if anything that I will contribute to you, it is a gap in your knowledge, because there's about 15 papers during this talk that you're unable to read. So this about gives you the scale. I mean, considering that all of them could have something important, it is impossible these days to keep up with all the information that's out there. So we'll have to rethink about how we acquire all that knowledge. We can't simply be expected to read. That's not the only thing that's changing. One of the other things is changing is that we now are considering soils in a far broader context. It is no longer about supporting just food production. So there is a wide range of services which bring benefit to society that we are bringing to the forefront. There's greater awareness that soils are contributing to these. Whether it is our water quality or our water quantity, we're becoming more and more aware of that in relation to the flooding that we are experiencing. It isn't just our rivers. Our rivers are overflowing, but it is the water that runs off all the lands and comes into those rivers, which is actually contributing to it. It's part of our erosion and the fact that soil is containing less water, it's penetrating less in the water and it's running off more quicker. That is something which we can also address with management, and these are choices we will have to make. People talk about very often the value, and we said, well, we need to start thinking about paying for these sort of things. Well, that's a tricky one. I got out some numbers here, and just to put that a bit into context, because when we think about pure economic benefit, food production wouldn't be top of the list. So we would start farming our soils for nutrient cycling or even for water rather than for food. So money isn't going to be the answer of it. We do know the importance of it, so we need about 0.6 hectare per person to produce our food. Of all the biodiversity that's there, 25% of all the biodiversity is in soils. our water quality is worth about 1.7 trillion globally. The water storage is about 3,700 tons per hectare, and the damage due to flooding is 5.5 billion here in the UK. So these are phenomenal amounts of costs, certainly when you put them relative to some of the other benefits, even something like structural support, subsidence due to drying cycles brings phenomenal costs with it. So it's important. We're losing 2 million tons per year globally, and the annual research investment is about 350 million. So when you think about what's the value that we put on it, maybe that is the real value that we put on it. So is that enough? Well, we can have endless debates on that. So why are we getting so much into trouble? And well, really, and what you hear a lot when you ask questions, what can we do? The answer is usually it's complicated. And it depends. And we haven't got all the answers out there. So we try sometimes to make the statements. And in the past, when we looked at, if we considered soil, we had an action on there, and we thought in quite a linear way, where we have the aim was to improve crop. So we did something to the soil, we measured the crop, and we had some outcome in there. It's quite a linear way of thinking, whether it was the physical or the chemical fertilizers in there, and that worked. Now, when you think about that if that action would also affect water availability, which would subsequently impact on the soil, which would impact on the crop establishment, and the crop establishment will impact on the water availability, even with something as simple as this, we already have quite a complicated system, and the outcome is no longer a single outcome, it's actually a whole width of outcomes. Bring a second one in there, and you can see that the complexity rapidly increases if we think back of all those other factors that we had in the previous slide and bring that all in, then we end up with what is known to be as a rather complicated and complex system. So does that matter? Well, it matters because the way we interact or is interacted with this system isn't just by our actions. It might be by our climate. It might be through our water availability. So there are various ways by which we interact with a system. And the way this system behaves and the outcomes we get is not simply determined by the actions that we put on it. It is equally so determined by the interrelationships that are within a system. So the behavior is as much affected by the way things interact with each other as it is by our actions on that. This is why we need to understand how all these things hang together and need to be able to see the interdependence in that and have a better understanding of that. We tend to focus on the conditions and think of ways of measuring different conditions, and we know far less about the interactions and how we should measure these interactions. But these are actually determine the outcomes of the system. All of this happens within a very heterogeneous landscape. So if it was just one soil type, it would be easy. And we have multiple drivers of change that act over multiple time scales and the multiple space scales. So it's complicated. I just want to stress the importance of that with a fairly simple example. So this is a very abstract example. You see here a population. And in that population, we would consider, for instance, the invasion of a pest or a disease. Now, if this is a mixture of susceptible and resistant plants, and we just put them randomly in a field, now if we have 40% of our plants resistant and a pathogen would enter that system, it will spread invasively through that system. If it's 42%, so a very minor change to our population, you can see that we get far smaller patches. So this is known as a sort of a percolation idea, and in the same way as you percolate your coffee and the water fills through there. It depends on the connections that exist within a system. And this is a way of thinking that demonstrates the non-linearity that we have in our response, which isn't quite brought into the way we think to our systems. So it is shown here that there's theoretically quite a sharp threshold in such a simple system where we only change one minor thing. Only 2% more of resistant varieties introduced into a field, rather than the entire field covered with that resistant variety. Now you may say, well, okay, that's theory, does that matter? So for another simple system, we put some experimental data on there, and here you see an example of a fungal invasion in a system like this, and we don't find the exact threshold, but we find a sharp, nonlinear transition in there. And that's important, because what does that mean? It means that if we are in our system in the area where you can see there is a very small response to our response variable, and that could be any soil condition that makes a change to the way organisms spread between two individual agents, then we'll find no response. But if we come very close to that threshold there, or sort of a tipping point, then we can find abrupt changes in the environment. So this really shows that we may think we are in a comfort zone, but we don't know how far we are from a tipping point. So that's one of the messages that will come out of there. A second message that will come out of there, that patchiness in a field is a normal phenomenon, particularly in diseases. Sometimes they pop up unexpectedly, sometimes they are recurring from year to year, but there seems to be a sort of a randomness in there which we subsequently try to correlate with what's going on. So the temptation would be that if you would have a patch like that, that you start looking at what soil conditions are different here and try to correlate that with that, where really we shouldn't have been thinking about management at this scale. We should have been managing it at a field scale. So the scale at which we manage things isn't always the same as the scale where we observe things, and it is that interlinkage which poses more challenging to us and should really guide us for some of the processes in what we're trying to measure, because we may be looking in the wrong decision if we try to correlate everything with symptoms that we can measure on site rather than with interactions between neighboring sites. Now, that image I could have done for 2 roots in the soil. I could have done it for resistant varieties in a field. It could have been a population of different arable fields in a landscape. Whatever we are, these sort of phenomena may occur, and we'll have to think about. So more nonlinear responses occur than we are traditionally used to. So it's complicated, that's true, but how do we deal with that? Well, we are still tempted to say, I want to know if I do this, what's the answer? I think at some point we'll have to accept that things are a little bit more complicated than that. And that means that the answers that are going to be given will be in a different form. It's no longer a yes or a no. There will be some other ways by which we have to evaluate our knowledge. And equally so, we may say, well, actually, the question you ask is wrong. So you may need to ask the right questions. But certainly, we need to and stop the blame game, as I would call it. We always tend to focus on when something has gone wrong, our soils are degrading. Who's done this? Who can we put the blame to? And actually, that doesn't get us anywhere. We shouldn't focus on what's gone wrong and who's to blame for that, because society is to blame for that. No individual actor is. Instead, we can turn this around. It's not just what's gone wrong, it just demonstrates that there is phenomenal potential to improve things. Soils interacts on everything that impacts on life. And that means that if we find a way to intervene with that, we don't just bring benefits to our yield, we can bring wider benefits to society. In order to do that, I think we'll just have to embrace the complexity. So find a way to cope with that, get used to that, and I'll see what we can do to help you in a way forward. So which paths do we choose to go in a way forward? And maybe you can put up the next question, if I can remember which one that was. We've done that one. So the question here would be that if you would have the choice, and don't think about what can be done, what do you think, if there's one thing you can change, what would it be? So choice is up to you there. And just want to see whether or not there is some collective view on there, whether or not we actually agree on what our goal is. So it may not be the right question, but one thing you can change, what do we focus on? Okay? Okay, I see the answers coming in. They're difficult for me to read and understand, but it is good to see there's actually a broad range of answers coming in. So we don't agree on what is the most important one, although organic matter, I don't know if the size means anything, but that probably seems to jump out. So focus on organic matter. Okay, maybe we can go on to the slide. Yeah, okay. So what do we focus on? And there's different ways of doing this. So one of the things we can focus on is actually what is that one single thing we want to do. And as you can see here, soil organic matter I put on here, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Why do we talk about that, given the current initiative, which will I explain in a moment? I call it our comfort zone. No disrespect there, but this is actually an area where we are well familiar with, and we've always concentrated upon. Knowing that organic matter is important and that we like it to increase isn't particularly a novel target. We haven't deliberately reduced the organic matter in soil. The second one is concentrating on the concept of soil health. Now, this is already a little bit more difficult because we probably are not going to agree on what soil health is. I think we all get the picture that a healthy soil will give a healthy crop, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to measure it. So here we end up like it's complicated. We have a more complicated question. Can we focus on that? So what do we know that is improving our soil health? And we'll have some discussions on that. The third way is say, well, actually, let's go completely different. Is there something out there which we haven't looked at in sufficiently detail in a different way that may offer an opportunity? So do we have an ambition to actually completely rethink our knowledge and say, well, there are some big gaps. We may not yet know how to do with it, but do we take that leap of faith? So the 4 per mil initiative, some of you probably have heard of it, if not all of you in this audience, but this really came down from the climate change discussions. And it's a great initiative because it is the first time that soil science actually formally is entered that agenda. So there's a formal recognition of the contribution that soils make to climate change, or to be more precise, the solutions that soil science and soils and farming as a result of that will have to offer towards climate change. So where does it come from? Well, it wasn't, as I could call it, a soil science calculation. It was a calculation which was balancing how many fossil fuels and CO2 emissions take place, how much carbon have we got globally roughly in the soil, and if we want to compensate that, what would be required? And that would be required would be an annual increase of 0.4% in our organic matter. And we can compensate for CO2 emissions by industry. So that may not be too complicated. So what does it mean? Well, just a little calculation in here, because there's been some debate about what this actually means, because although governments signed up to it, if you would really ask them, does anybody know what this means and how we're going to do it? The answer is probably no, we don't. But assume a field with about 3%. We have to assume something about the depth of it, but let's say 30, 40 centimeters. Then roughly there will be about 116 tons in that topsoil. To increase this by 0.4%, we would need to have an additional 400 kilogram per hectare per year of soil carbon in there. So that's roughly what it comes down to. So the increase is relative to the amount that's already there. So it is not that we increase 3% to 3.4% to 3.8%. It's 0.4% of what's already present. So if I did that correctly last night, in about 10-year period, we look at relatively very modest increases. Now, this may not have such a phenomenal impact. We may probably not be shocked by these sort of increases. So in farming terms, it may not bring the step change that we have in mind. But keep an eye in mind, this wasn't intended to improve our yield. This is intended to solve our climate problems, which in the longer term are going to benefit here. So here we've got a clear example about where things can make a contribution to other to other services that will benefit society and farming. So a global target, it's not just for arable land, so there isn't going to be one person responsible, but of course through farming we've got better ways of interacting with this. So estimated, what would it mean considering the amount of carbon? People have tried to do this, so it's about 0.55 ton carbon per hectare for England and Wales. Scotland would have a far higher target to reach, and that's because the majority of the soil, of the peat soils and the high organic soils are in there. And as I pointed out, it's a relative measure. So independence will make it more likely for us to hit the targets, I would say. Like I point out, it's not a new ambition. I mean, we didn't really need to be told that improving soil organic matter is a difference. So is this going to make a real difference to us? Probably not. But the main difference is that it's given the community a focus to hit a target. Now, we may not know how we're going to hit that target. We may not know how we're going to evidence that we hit that target. So perhaps we can also see this as an ambition. But in addition to that, I think if we're going to do this, what it will do is bring some indirect benefits also to farming, because this is going to be a recognition that farming, rather than eroding our soils, can make a positive contribution to soils and a positive contribution to society. So it may have quite a big impact in perception from the general public. Is it possible? Well, we have some estimate here of what could be achieved with certain practices. And you can see as an order of magnitude, this would all be possible. So if this was our only target, and I asked, what would you increase? And people said, well, soil organic matter. Well, let's convert to permanent grass. Well, okay, we may not be able to feed all the people, so there are conflicts already arising in here. And this is the problem with having a single target to focus. So it can't be the single target that we are, but as you can see, we can certainly make a substantial contribution to this. But the effects may not be permanent. So we may think about increasing carbon over time, but soils can't absorb carbon indefinitely, so there are some limits to what can be done. We don't yet know exactly what are the hotspots that we should target in that are most ambitious, because remember that it's a global target, this, so it may not be a field target. And we have got really no good way of measuring how we're going to do this. So not all land can sequester all the carbon, but an estimate is that agricultural land would mean an offset of 20 to 30% of this. So that's a significant contribution, positive contribution we can make. No consideration of quality of organic matter. So here's where the scientists come in and says, well, actually that's not good enough. This is a little bit more complex than this. And yes, we will have to consider that, because it will have to be a real increase in organic matter and not moving things about. And it will have to be a lasting effect. So we need to focus on some of the hotspots, and we really need to know, like, how are we going to measure this? So it seems to me that this may be a target that is definitely worth pursuing. It's going to be beneficial to farming. We have a lot of things to overcome, but the ideas behind it will increase in carbon. We've got a healthy climate, a healthy soil, and a healthy crop. So what can there be against it? But I put it into the category, I think it maybe I'm wrong, we have some discussions on there. Chasing the target will be a modest change to farming, to the yield in there. I think probably if we are wanting to feed the world, we may have to be a little bit more ambitious than this. So it will bring a step change to climate. So some of those changes here that we may pursue and should pursue are not automatically bringing the greatest benefit to farming, but they'll bring the benefit to our climate, which will subsequently feed back into it. So that was an example of chasing a single target. We could chase improving irrigation and reducing flood. We can do that. What we've got more a problem with is bringing everything together and considering all the aspects. This is where soil health comes in. So soil health is not necessarily having some animals in the soil, so it is a broader concept. It really comes down to producing more food while considering all the other aspects and all the other benefits that soil bring to society, and improving those as well. Now, as I already say that, you'll realize that it's not going to be easy to put a number on that. So what do we know about this? This is quite a complicated aspect. So in trying to prepare this, of all the 40,000 articles that are written every year, I just decided I'll just take one. So I'm going to present you one. Why do I take this paper? Not necessarily giving us all the answer, but I liked it. So I liked the approach that's being followed in here. And the approach is slightly different. So it is not our normal way of doing a literature review. What was actually done is that there is an identification of the main threats, which was done by a panel of stakeholders, farmers, other stakeholders, policymakers, and together was done, okay, what are the major threats? How many articles do we have? It was about 37,000 in this case. We can't cope with that. It was narrowed down a bit more, and also in a way like, okay, if these are our threats, what are practical solutions in there? So that a list was made of what are sort of practices which our expert panel, with that expert panel judged are possible to do, and what evidence do we really have that this improves soil health. Now that evidence was acquired through a survey. That survey focused on a couple of questions. So they were all given the same information, the same papers. They were asked the same questions, and they were asked to give a judgment on that. As you give a judgment to a complex problem, we all look at it in a different way. We believe it or we don't believe it. And a consensus was reached from that through an interactive approach. If they roughly agree, it was fine. If they didn't agree, they would have that discussion and see whether they could reach an agreement. So that resulted in an agreed consensus, assessing our current knowledge through different angles and a collective approach to that. So it's no longer a simple academic exercise. What were the questions? Do you think the evidence shows that it's effective? Do you think it is certain, the evidence? Are there any potential negative side effects if we do this? It may be effective, but does it go seriously wrong sometimes? And what considerations are there for soil type and location? So really, how broadly is this applicable? So these were the questions that were taken into consideration when the information was evaluated. So this is not a study I did, but these are some of the results that come out of it. So is it beneficial? Is it likely to be beneficial? It depends. Is it unknown, or is it likely to be ineffective or harmful? Now the harmful one was just let's stop using pesticides and fertilizers. So that was a clear-cut evidence for the panel, like that's the only one that's going to be harmful for our farming and soil health. So because the farming and the yield is part of that. The first thing that strikes me from that is that of all the practices that we have in place, there is very little ones that are supported by evidence that they're beneficial for soil health. So in all the things we do, it may be beneficial, but the evidence is not there. And that raises the question, what's the basis of the decision that we take to implement certain practices? If it's not science-based or not supported by evidence, why are we making this move? So let's reflect a little bit on some of those and see which one are in the beneficial ones. These are not unexpected. Integrated nutrient management, grow of cover crops is in there, and the use of crop rotation. Now these are these days well-established ones. The use of cover crops is what people refer to sometimes as a bit of a hot topic. That means that there's a lot of research done of it, and that lot of research gives evidence that we'll put it into the category that we're relatively certain. So in this category, we believe that, or the panel believed that it's effective, they're fairly certain about it, and there are very little negative side effects. So it's a safe option. Now, cover crops, although we could say, well, actually, this is good, there's always a way to improve things. So they'll improve soil fertility, improve soil structure, managing weeds, environmental management. They all agree that that's going to be good for them, but there's some disagreement as well. Is it really successful in suppression of weeds? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Does it really improve the rooting depth of the crop, which could be quite important for more resilient growth? Does it loosen the subsoil? Does it conserve soil moisture? So these are still the areas that, although there's sufficient evidence base to say this is a good practice, by collecting more evidence, we will be able to possibly further improve this practice. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just want to highlight so you can see some of those practices, because some of them are a bit surprising, I think. I mean, the control traffic and the timing of it, I would have expected to be highly beneficial, but it's in the likely to be beneficial categories. So there are some uncertainties about that. It's not quite there. That doesn't mean it's not a good thing. It means that insufficient evidence was presented to the panel and therefore available. So we have some more work to do, but the consensus is that these probably are beneficial as well, even though we don't have the evidence. So change of tillage, convert to organic, may be surprising as well, but here's where the trade-offs come in. So changing our tillage we would generally consider to be positive, but it isn't always positive. And trade-offs are the ones where it's difficult. If we think of tillage, reduced tillage, good for storing more carbon, irrespective of the debate in where that carbon is transferred or moved around in the profile or really stored. We think it would be a good thing. It also compacts the soil more, makes it wetter, more susceptible to diseases. So we have the trade-offs in here, which will put it into the category that depends. And that means that a lot of these have got potentially high negative side effects. If you do it in the wrong way and get it at the wrong place, you could be seriously causing some trouble. So unknown effectiveness, interesting to see some of that apparently we still don't know the timing of plowing and whether or not we have enough evidence in there to see, well, this is really something we should be considering and it's going to have a good impact on soil health. So the amendment of bacteria and fungi, I'll just come out because I want to come back to that a little bit later. So the question is, what are we going to do with this? We can say, well, if we have those practices which we know to improve health, let's focus on those. That's one way to look at this. Let's put our eggs in the baskets in the things that work and let's make them work better. We may be able to improve. It's difficult to say how far we can improve it. And there's another way of looking at things and say, well, let's look at something like this, which currently is not in, or it's unknown, and we haven't got the evidence in there. Does that mean that these are the areas where we shouldn't worry about these? Actually, these might indicate the areas where there's room for improvement. So if we have some of the evidence which gives us an indication that this can bring significant changes, maybe we should focus on those areas rather than ignore those areas. So I think from this paper, the way it was done, the interaction between scientists and stakeholders in evaluating the literature, I think that's a good way forward. It is focusing the review and the evidence that's being collected on questions which collectively are being judged as being important. And maybe this is one of the ways by which we can deal with that overload of information and being unable to digest all the information and narrowing it down a little bit more. It's not just a job of the scientist. Joint ownership of the analysis, I would say that, because we just give us the information, but we may have different opinions on how important that information is. Whereas we really want some hard evidence in there and hard numbers, we have to accept that we work with very complex systems and we may balance things in a different way. That means that we may have to move on of actually analyzing our science in a different way. It is no longer as simple that 1 + 1 is 2. It may be a different answer. I'm a scientist who very much believes in numbers And so for me, this was a difficult concept. But social scientists may have a different view on that than psychologists. And there's different things that will help us making different things important and balance things and evaluate in different ways. And there may not be a right way when there's so much uncertainty around. So there's room for improvement there. What are the drawbacks? Well, it's very much focused on a single management. They were all listed like, what if I do this, what if I do that? I don't think that's going to be the solution for the future. It's not one thing. We need to look at a package deal. So if you want to change things, it may not be that you say, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. It may actually say that the answers are going to be put forward like, you're doing this now. If you want to improve it, you'll have to change A, B, C, and D. So massive changes to your system rather than gradual changes. And we have almost no knowledge or evidence based on how we're going to move forward to that. So that's a big challenge that we need to start thinking about. What advice can we give in multiple management options rather than the gradual step-in changes that we are used for? Like I said, there's a tendency to focus on the knowns and make them better, but maybe we should actually focus on the unknowns that we have in science and take a leap of faith and say, well, this is where we can make the improvements. So the other thing that came out of it, we have a gap in our evidence base. So this is where I think some of the innovations will come in. So we see some example here from the innovation or the Agri-Tech Center for Applied Crop Science. And these centers are especially designed to help industry with the questions and bring the science better into it. So a bit of a complicated graph here, but I'll explain roughly what the concept behind is. So what we have here is some very big containers of soil. And on this soil, we can apply tillage and cultivations. We can put crops in there, and then we can bring all those crops so we can grow them in predefined soil physical and structure conditions. So we're no longer dependent on what's out there in the field. We can now say, well, my knowledge gap is here. I want to know the effect of A, B, C, and D. So remove some of the uncertainty in that. We can subsequently take them and move them into growth cabinets or into the glass house. So we can take our tillage all the way through to the growth and analyze the growth. In addition, we can look at soil erosion effects on there. So we can do a sort of a multiple assessment of our soil during the cropping season. At the end of the cropping season, here you can see one of those containers, about a cubic meter of soil each, where we grow in there. They can go back into the cycle. We can apply our tillage strategies on the can, and we can bring multiple crops in there and consider crop rotation. So what we really have is a realistic agricultural farming system into a big microcosm here. So this will give us the opportunity to remove some of those uncertainty. If we want to assess what the effect is of deep compaction and how we can imply a strategy to improve that, it's quite difficult to do in the field because we don't know where that deep compaction is. We'll have to assess that. It will vary from location to location, from field to field. We're not in control in asking different questions. Here we can bring that deep compaction in there at a pre-designed level. We can decide how much compaction we in there, so we can assess the effect of the soil strength in there and really bring more of the control into our arable systems. And I think these will be quite a big step change into providing the evidence-based. Not just in that we will control our soil environment, we will control our growth conditions as well. So we can assess now, if we do a certain management strategy, what would it be if it was a warm year and a dry year? What would it be if it was a wet year? So we can assess the different strategies and get a better advice towards the implementation of it, give more guidance when it will work, when it wouldn't work. So targeted advice. Briefly up here, it isn't just the facilities that matter. What's behind that is a breadth of people dealing with soil and soil health issue. Not just that, we've got quite a big team also dealing with development of technologies which can be tested in there. So all those kits will be kitted up with all the technologies that we can think of to monitor what's happening in that soil environment. and the same for our crop scientists. So it's an integrated knowledge base with new facilities that are available for industry to use. So if you have questions or interest in that, come and ask. So it will allow a wider range of soil types, crops, and biotic stressors in interactions to be tested. Integrated facilities. Experimental work is not weather dependent, so as a result, the facilities can address key issues which can be raised by industry. So you can provide the questions for us, and the answers collectively can be assessed. It will focus particularly on pest and disease management, so health of crop, but it really gives us a good way forward to assess the health of the soil within these treatments at the same time. So the innovations at that scale, which are going to be quite important, because I think this is where we address the gap between what goes on in the lab and what goes on in the field. It's always been dealing with that heterogeneity. In the lab, we've removed all the heterogeneity. In the field, it is there, and we need to find a way to bridge that link. So I realize that we're going quite fast for time, so I'll move on. So the next thing I want to talk about, what if we think about something else? So what is it we have missed? And really, I want to focus more on the biological life in soil. So the living organisms in soil, there's phenomenal amounts in there. So we've got about 10 million cells spread over 20 square meters, but really that's in about a gram of soils. So there are phenomenal amounts of bacteria in soil. Now, this always gives the idea, well, if there's that many, we can just consider them as all well mixed. That's not going to be the case. So if we look at the transect of soil, although there's phenomenal amounts in there, they really are in favorable niches around some of the solid parts on the aggregates. At the interfaces in soil, we've got the porals here. But this doesn't look like an area which is plastered with organisms. So there's a lot of unexplored space out there. What does that mean? Can we improve this? Can we bring more life in the soil? What are the opportunities out there? Because these organisms are dictating the majority of processes that soils are delivering and important for our crop growth. So is there potential in here? Is there room for improvement? So just a little example in there. Here, some experimental results. Fairly simple thing. So we had a bean plant here. And what I did here is we planted, or we placed, a source of inoculum of a fungus or fungal pathogen at certain distances of the seed. Now what you see is that caused a lesion in there. It was Rhizoctonia solani. So that caused a lesion, and we looked at where does the contribution come from, where the location is. So this is the area where the seed is. So the further away from the seed, the less likely it was to cause infection. And that's what we would expect. If it's further from where it is, it has to grow through it and give infection. But interestingly, if you look at when you place it, so the disease is quite some distance above the seed, but at this place here, it doesn't as much matter how far it is from the target. What matters is when you look at those results is how far it was from the seed. So that really showed that the driving force of this comes from the seed. It's the seed that produces exudates. Those exudates diffuse through the soil. They hit the inoculum source. It germinates, could be spores in there, they germinate, they start growing towards our target. So there's multiple processes involved in here. Diffusion of exudates, germination, growth of fungi through that. All of these are affected by soil conditions that occur at this very narrow range here. So we've considered soils at field scales. Now we really start looking at, well, what matters, what is causing this infection, is all determined in a very narrow area in soil. So what do we know about that? Well, almost nothing. So, and when I was taught soil science, I was taught soil is a black box. So you put something in and something comes out. And even the suggestion that we would ever be able to look inside that box was considered ridiculous. So what I will do is I will through considering fungi, give some example. And for time, I will skip the next slide, which really was just to show that there was a lot of nonlinearity responses in there, that very small changes to soil physical conditions can make a fungal colony switch from a very small colony and rapidly to something which expands and spreads very rapidly through soil. So soil physical conditions matter for the way organisms exploit the soil. And we will be able to obtain that knowledge. If you can start this video, because this is really the black box which I was told we can't look into. I was told that soil is a bundle of capillary tubes where water will move through, and all our theories come from that. This is an image obtained with X-ray tomography. You probably have seen many examples of that, but it is a way by which we can look inside soil non-destructively. And what will happen at a moment is that we take away the solid phase. And what you'll be able to see is the internal structure of soil. And you will see it appearing here. And this is the pore space of soil. So this is where all the processes take place, in those pores, at the interfaces of those pores and the solid phase. Now, this is a very complicated picture, and that's fine. But it's going to change the way we've looked at things, because a lot of our science so far has concentrated on the solid phase. And I think we're shifting things here towards concentrating on the pore space. We now have the opportunity to concentrate on the gaps in soil, the bits where we know nothing about, but where all the processes are taking place. So, and this is at microscopic scales. Admittedly, this is not going to be applicable in the field, but we'll come to that in a moment. So, what do we know about fungi and structure? So, we have some other techniques in there where we can look at life in soil, and those yellow dots is where we would find those fungal hyphae once they've spread through the soil. It would look roughly like that, so we can overlay microscopic images with soil structure in 2D scales. So that raises some questions, at least to me, like why do we have those separated places in here? And when you look at it at the first sight, you would say, well, the fungi seems to prefer the places where there's more space in soil. I always say it's a bit of a lazy organism. It takes the highways in soils rather than the difficult routes through it. Remember that the pores that are in here, they're still in there, and they would be large enough for the fungal hyphae to go through. It just doesn't go through it. Equally so, however, there are areas where, why is it not there? So how is that we are finding it so heterogeneous in there? And the answer is because we can't see how this is connected with each other in a 2D. So we'll show just quickly a 3D image of that. Here you have this very complicated connected network of pores. On the right, you see a transect in here. The gray bits are part of a pore, the largest pore, which is all connected with each other. The white bits are not connected with each other. And if you can start the video for that, it will move down through the soil. So put yourself in a gray area, and as you move through the soil, you'll find out that very quickly you have a dead end. So it doesn't matter how close things are to each other. What matters is how things are connected within this pore space. And that's a different way of looking in that. Secondly, it doesn't matter how big a pore size is for organisms to interact with each other. What matters is how it's connected with each other. We've always tried to correlate organisms with size classes of pores. We should have another look at things. What matters is the connectivity of this. So what's affecting the connectivity? Various things are affecting the connectivity. But here you see how some of the management of soils will affect that connectivity. So a native succession since 1989 in some field trials in the US, when we converted it to a non-till corn soil bean wheat rotation, then what you see is that we have a completely different internal structure of soil. Now, that intrigues me personally because both of them are functional ecosystems. So I wouldn't be able to say this one is better than that. They deliver different functions, and they've co-evolved and look completely different. But it will be quite different in the way these systems behave physically and biologically. So can we get that better understanding of how those two are interlinked? It isn't just the pores that we can look at these days. We can also look at organic matter. So here we take an aggregate. If we use the same technology, X-ray tomography, here we can look at where particulate organic matter is inside the aggregates. We can use that to see how different practices contribute to the protection of organic matter inside those aggregates. We struggle still a bit with identifying where water and air is, but if we bring our mathematical modeling and on-site, and at this scale we can do this with physical models, we can identify where water and air is within this small scale in soil. So at this place, we would be able to make a link from the larger scale management to this microscopic scale conditions in the soil environment. And this is the place where microorganisms interact with each other. So you can see that we've got separations of organic matter, separations of water and connectivity, all within that complicated pore geometry. So this will determine how organisms interact with each other, how they interact with plants, how things diffuse through soil. So if we are to find a way to steer the microorganisms in a way we want them to behave, to benefit from it, we'll need to understand how we're going to control these processes. Just a quick image in there. It isn't just a physical structure. We have got our microorganisms as well. They will be able to secrete all sort of surfactants. And this is an example from a colleague, Andrew Spires, who looked at Pseudomonas species. And the different species will have different levels of surfactant properties that they will secrete, which means that if we bring them into soil, they will have a significant contribution on the amount of water that the same structure of soil would hold. So microorganisms can change the amount of water that is available to soil. The question will be, what can we do with this? So at the micro scale, this will bring some changes. We've got some images here of some neutron scanning now here, which will allow us to look at the distribution of water around a root. And this is going through a cycle from wet soil, going to dry soil, and then re-wetting it again. And what's interesting in here is that you can see that areas near the root are not getting as wet again. So the root has secreted mucilage, which has changed the physical properties of the soil. And as a result of that, at this microscopic scale, the conditions have changed in which our microorganisms reside. So that's quite important. It's an observation at the moment, but this will determine the interactions between the microorganisms and the root. So if we can steer this in a way and change our properties of our root, then we can change the biophysical environment within which the microorganisms reside, and we can probably improve the way they interact with our crops. Oh, sorry, just some other examples in here. So we're also able to look at soil-root contact, and equally so with PET scanning, we can actually look at carbon flows through the soil. So we're getting a range of techniques, quite a good understanding at that very small scale about what's happening. So the whole range of techniques is roughly given here, so there's not one thing, but there's a lot of innovation going on at the moment at the research area, focusing on trying to understand the conditions and the processes that go on here. So does it matter? Well, we don't know yet, but we can look what would happen if we model these processes. So what we do is we apply biophysical modeling, and we start looking at how would, for instance, a fungus, if we would employ and understand how a fungus works, how would it exploit these pore spaces? So what does it matter? The impact on it we'll assess in first instance in a theoretical way, putting a picture together from all those different images that we have. So this allows us to explore the sort of what if things. What if? Would it make any difference if we would do this or if we would do that? Now, one of the things which strikes me a lot that comes out of it is that if we take one small cube of soil and we say it has got 3% of carbon, then as you saw at that microscopic scale, that carbon isn't everywhere, it is distributed heterogeneously. Now, if we consider it to be everywhere or make different assumptions about it being more clustered, and if you remember back the original pictures where we had particular organic matter in there, then as the clustering changes, our CO2 production, which is calculated, is massively changing. So we have big changes in here in the order of magnitude of about 200% variability. Now, that's quite important because it means that all the properties that we've been measuring at a bulk scale where we're comfortable with, average conditions that we cannot relate to the processes that happen at the micro scale. We can keep on searching for it, but there will always be an amount of uncertainty in that due to ignoring some of the microscopic processes in there. So unfortunately, we cannot ignore them. We've always ignored them so far, but this shows you that I was wrong. We can't ignore the processes that happen at that scale. Now, what we're going to do with that is the next step. But you can think about that, well, if we find better ways of doing this, better ways than assuming it's everywhere and it interacts with everything. Okay, we can't go to this level of detail in the field, but we can make some assumptions. So the questions we have to ask, what level of uncertainty is acceptable and what knowledge of that microscopic processes do we really need to have to understand that it's going to make a difference at a larger scale. But this is a big knowledge gap that we have. And to me, it indicates potential to improve. If we understand this better, we can use this knowledge to make substantial changes to the way our soils are operating. So this, for me, is something where we have a big gap in there. So the next step that we'll do with this is we put multiple species in there, look at interactions with each other, and quite simple, I always say, we've always studied two organisms on a plate. On a two-dimensional plate, two organisms will always mate. Put them in soil, and they can grow past each other and never know of each other that they are there. Consequences for biological control are phenomenal, but for species interactions in general. What this is going to tell us is what are the key drivers of biodiversity. So what soil properties will contribute to enhancing biodiversity in there. At least it will steer us in a direction. Is it the physical heterogeneity? Is it the chemical heterogeneity? Is it the biological heterogeneity? What fungal traits, what biological traits will enhance biodiversity in soil? What biological traits will make it more invasive, will make it less invasive? Because let's be honest, we may fail to introduce organisms successful in soil, but nature is quite successful in it because it has no problems in evolving into new pathogens that will spread through our systems. So the potential is out there. We just haven't succeeded in finding what's really driving that. So if we focus on that, we can really harness that potential in there and make significant differences. I hope the next slide comes up. Yeah. So really, this moves towards designing soils. I think that's a new focus in there. It's an ambition. And you can say, well, we're never going to get there. Maybe we won't. But I truly believe that we have ignored the processes at a scale where we haven't looked at, and that's the scale where it happens. And if we improve our knowledge on there, then that's going to help us in designing new techniques. So the evidence is out there. So proof of concept, we know fungi play an important role in stabilizing soils. So if we know better how it colonizes the soil, maybe we can make improvements to the way they do that. Bacteria display a large area of surfactants which will affect the water content. So we know it, we just don't know yet how to steer this. Roots can alter soil structure, improve water infiltration. But we don't know yet what root traits are actually the best combination with our soil conditions to improve on this. All of this are dictated by those microscopic processes combined with the larger scale changes in technology and introducing of the technologies. So it is the integration. So our challenge is to bring these technologies out of the lab and identify which of those small changes offer the greatest potential to make changes to our agricultural systems. So this, I think, is an area of great potential and which I would put into the category of a leap of faith. So what's going to change in the next year? And I'll turn my back to you because I may not remember the order. Well, where are we with farming in 2030, to put it like that? And I put 2030 because I know I'll be retired by then, so you can't come back to me. So your soils will be healthy and sustainably managed. Well, that's an easy way. You may say, well, how are we going to get there? Doesn't really matter. If we're not there by 2030, we're in trouble. So one way or another, we're going to get there. The question is, will we be able to provide enough food when we get there? But our soils will get there. If we don't manage it, the soils will manage it for us. Contributions to ecosystem benefits. I think there's going to be a greater emphasis in farming, not just on the yield improvement, but on also the other systems that soils will function. And we can put some of the questions in there in the end. The 4 per mil initiative is a clear example in that. Are more initiatives like that going to be around the corner? What will happen, I think, is that increasingly there's going to be the pressure on soils to deliver and contribute and improve to those other systems. Farming will be affected by that. So we may actually be asked to change our systems to improve carbon storage, to improve water infiltration. That means if those questions are going to come in the future, we need to be ready for that now to be able to address them. An interesting question would be, who's going to pay for that? 4 per mil increase in carbon content. I think we can all agree on that. We're more than happy to improve our carbon content. It's good to see that we now have a target, which is a global target. So it's now novel that we have this target which we collectively can go behind, because we may not agree, I won't agree that having that single target is the way forward, but improving soil carbon in soils is a general aim that we should all strive after. It may not be the only one that we strive after, but it is one that we can all be happy with. What it will mean is that if we're able to evidence that we do this, so that's the next question. We can do it, but can we provide on-farm evidence with new technologies in measuring the changes at the scale? If we can do that, then that means that we will offer the evidence that we make positive contributions to ecosystem services. And that's what's lacking at the moment. So even if we would achieve this and bring those positive changes to carbon exchange, what we want is that we could say on the farm, look, I've managed my soils in this way. This is what I've delivered for you. It's not necessarily delivering my higher yield at this moment in time, but I've brought other benefits for you. That will be the basis for some sort of a compensation or recognition, which will need to happen simultaneously. Faster uptake of solution through a greater evidence base, I think that's required. I demonstrate you some of those technologies which are out there, those larger scale facilities which we are developing. They are specifically targeted towards providing the evidence base. If we are quicker in providing the evidence base that something works, it is quicker for the technologies to find its way into the field. So I think what will happen and will change in the coming years is that we have a faster transition of emerging technologies and knowledge into practice, because we are find better ways to provide that evidence base. Monitoring direction of change, I think this is an area where we will focus on. I'm not totally sure yet how we're going to get there. There's a lot of emphasis at the moment in monitoring conditions of soil. I think these developments are going to help us, but what we really need to understand is at the farm scale, not just the conditions measuring, but measuring the change of the conditions and how they interact with each other. Designing soils as a living system, I think this for me is my golden aim, so I'm quite happy to say, well, let's take that leap of faith. And that may mean that we're going to completely change the way we look at it. We are trying to find and identify ways which are affecting the micro scale. So this is going to bring long-term benefits. So we may be asked to do things that we won't see the effect at the moment, but are going to contribute on the longer term to improve soil health and will build benefits back on the longer term. But this, I think, is looking at soils in a completely different way. So if we believe that there's answers in there in doing that, and I believe there are, but others may disagree, then I think this is one of the areas where we should put our effort. It's also an area where at the moment there's an awful lot of interest in academia. Now, It hasn't found its way into practice yet, but I think we'll have to continue to put our efforts also in these sort of areas and not just in the immediately applied solutions to make sure that we are making our systems future-proof. This will help us to design soils through roots. So the roots, and you've had some talks about that in the previous talk, but we can breed our crops with different root traits. Now, these root traits at the moment do insufficiently consider the changes it will make to our soils. By the examples that I've given you, the emerging technologies are going to tell us how that interaction is, which will mean that we can give better guidance to what we want, what traits do we want from our root system for specific soil types. This is going to be massively changing because it means that crops may no longer just be selected for their yield, they may be selected for traits that are below ground and that we have been mostly unaware of so far. So, complex, yes, sorry, it is complex, and I think we'll have to deal with that, and I think collectively we'll find a way forward, but the message is also, unfortunately in life, there are no shortcuts. So, with that, I will conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening, and I think we'll move to questions. And sorry for taking a little more time than was scheduled.
Well, I've learned more than I ever thought possible to know about soils in the last 50 minutes or so. So thank you very much, Professor Otten, for that. The timing wasn't too bad, actually. We're going to take just a short break, just a few minutes while we reset the stage, give you a chance for a comfort break. The loos are out the back there. And then can we be back here in 5 minutes, ready for the Q&A session, where we'll be going through the questions. Don't forget, if you've still got questions you want to submit, please do it through Slido. If you put your name on it, on the question, that helps me to identify who's in the room, who I can throw one of these microphone balls at to ask the question themselves. And also, yeah, that's it. So go to the loo. See you back here in 5 minutes. Thanks very much. Oh, and one last round of applause for Professor Otten. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a comfort break. If you're watching from home, you've made a cup of coffee, settled back down. As you can see, Professor Otten and I have moved to the more relaxed environment of the soft set on the stage now. I've got my giant Smarties or Skittles in front of me ready to hurl out into the audience for those ready to ask questions. But I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask the first question myself, because I thought it was a fascinating talk. And one of the things that really struck me, Professor Otten, was the amount of knowledge we're gaining about what's happening in our soil. We're really opening up that black box and starting to understand what's going on at in quite some detail at a microscopic level. But how practical is it going to be to translate that learning into actions that we can deliver on a field scale? Are we going to be able to make use of that knowledge to change the way we act at a field scale?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, because the examples that I gave to you there at the moment are very far from practical applications. So this is why I refer to this as our leap of faith. I mean, if we ever come to finding a way of interfering with that or controlling that, we wouldn't have our answers ready. So this is really preparing and having belief in that we can do this. So can we do this? Yes, absolutely. I think we can. If we know at that microscopic scale whether it is the physical or the biological or the chemical conditions that are changing our environment, if we know, for instance, which biological traits will be more successful in particularly soil conditions, then we will be able to help us to guide organisms that we want to introduce into the soil through, for instance, seed coating or something like that. At the moment, all that technology is developed in labs, not considering the importance of soil. The introduction of organisms will be an important aspect of there, and technological advances are being made for that. But what we haven't got is what happens with them once they're in the soil. Some of this here showed you that it's going to be tremendously important and probably critical towards the establishment of whatever we will try to bring in the soil. So I think guidance will become there towards industry on there. On the land, will we be able to control the microscopic properties? Maybe not immediately, not in the sort of direct way like if I do this, I will improve the connectivity at a microbial scale. And that's probably the wrong way of asking the questions. But I did show you that we can look at these microscopic scale, how organic matter is distributed in the soil, and we will be able to understand how microorganisms interact with that. And once we know that, we can correlate that with some larger scale land management strategies. We don't just need to think of a way from scaling all our knowledge up to the larger thing. All those examples I show and all that research can actually be done within practical settings, because whether I get that aggregate out of field A or field B makes little difference, but it may help us to build up that understanding about how we make the correlations between the microscopic scale and the larger scale. So the sort of land and the physical changes we can get some answers to. We haven't got them now, but I'm confident there will be ways of doing this. And we haven't just looked in this direction at all. So this is an area where I think for the future. Are we ever going to be in a position that we really can design our soils? Probably not. But we will be able to identify what the winners and what the losers are, and then concentrate our efforts on how we're going to change those situations. Whether we change them through changing our physical structure, through the microbial properties, through our root traits. Probably the roots are the most easy way for us to control what's happening at that level, and we may have to start thinking about what type of exudates come out there that will select for specific microbial populations in there, and what benefit they will bring in combination to specific structures. So there may not be a single answer out there, like it always will have to be did. It might be that in this soil, we'll get that combination, in this soil we get that. And this comes back to what I said earlier. It's not going to be, I'll do this. It's probably going to be a package deal that will be offered and what we'll have to concentrate on. So that would be my answer. And when? 2030.
That's it. I mean, it's fascinating. The concept of designer soils is a fascinating concept. And by the sound of it, it may mean that over the next 20 years, we sort of start to change the vocabulary of farmers, we start to talk about these things, about what specifically we're targeting in terms of changing in the soil when we're changing our tillage approach, for example, or in the way we're using chemical strategies on the soil.
I think that's true, but I think in fairness, we've always done that. I think we're putting it now in a new context, and we may now start thinking about bringing carbon in soil is important for climate change, but it has always been important for crop growth as well. And we've always thought about what are the ways to improve these sort of conditions. What we haven't done is made all the links with all the other services that soils are offering. So there isn't an awful lot changing, because in the end, all those interactions have always taken place. I think what will happen is that maybe some of those other entrances will start driving the solutions that we'll need to find. So like soil carbon increase for climate change, it may come in as a driver. At the moment, it is a signing up without a penalty for a commitment. So it's still a bit of a loose agreement, but the intention is there, and there's a tension where I think collectively we can rally behind. We don't always need to wait for regulations to come in place when we believe that something is a good thing to do. So I think there will be different ways by which we'll interfere with it. Are we ever going to be asked to stop farming crops and farm for water? I don't think so. That wouldn't be the right way to do, but when you remember some of the economic numbers we put up there and the value of some of the services, there is clear benefit to make other profits somewhere else.
I'm glad you came onto that subject, because that was something else that really intrigued me, the idea of we may incentivize farmers based on either the amount of carbon that they're putting back into the soil or on the amount of water that they're managing to make the soil capture. And that there is now, we've got a question from the audience that relates to that, and I'm hoping that David M is in the audience. Have we got David M here? Right. How good are you at catching, David? I'm going to hurl the ball at you. Oh, not the glass with it, I hope.
Yeah, I just wondering really on a, coming out of Europe, if there was a case where the UK government could base our payments on, if we could have a matrix of soil health levels within regions, areas, counties or whatever, and then be able to put the payments for increases within that.
Yeah, so this comes down to...
Can we measure it, basically? That's the idea. Can we measure it in order to make those payments?
And I think this is a very complicated issue. Of course, nobody knows what will happen, but intuitively, I think expecting that the government is going to put money on the table and giving it to farmers because they've increased carbon in soil, I think that's not going to happen. I don't think there will be a direct payment for these services. Also, when you look at some of those prices, I mean, we couldn't pay it, we couldn't afford it. So what price are you going to put on it? Having said that, if we think about carbon and bringing carbon in the soil, which will help us to hit targets, it would be completely wrong if we would go down a route and say, thank you very much, farmers, for reducing our CO2 emission. It means that we no longer have to focus on industry and we can keep on polluting in there because you'll compensate for that. And that's where the issue becomes a little bit more tricky, so that needs to be avoided. So there are trade-offs in here and we can find a way of bringing that benefit in there. Is economy going to be the only driver? I don't think it is. I think we should concentrate on the benefits that it will bring. So I think if we're going to say, well, what's going to bring the economic benefit and who's going to pay for it, that may not be the route by which these things will be implemented. What we need to focus on is what are those benefits. So it is not just that it will bring benefit to climate change and that money is going to be fed into farming. Actually, those benefits will bring benefit to the farming again. And if we better evidence that, then I think we've got a better chance of having those technologies being taken up. And at the moment, I think that evidence base is lacking to a large extent. Whether we do that in economic values or in other ways, I think it needs to be clear that if we improve those services, what benefits are being brought back to farming. And we haven't got that. So that's one side of it. We can go on more.
Well, on the measurement, so I think you were saying earlier that maybe we haven't got the sensors to do it now, but yes, that's an area to focus on.
I think a key aspect in there, I think, is that a lot of those targets at the moment are set at a national level. I think to get any benefits and any recognition for what we're doing, we need to be able to focus a bit more on on-farm measurements. And that's where a lot of technology comes in and a lot of improvements are being made. So I think we are building up that evidence, and that evidence will have to be locally on the farm, I think, so that we can correlate that directly with activities that the farmers undertake, so that we know the improvements that have been made to soil health, whatever way we're going to measure that, or some aspects of that. So it's the technological advances that need to focus on that. A lot of that is already happening in the context of precision agriculture, so we already try to do that. Precision agriculture also will help us to inform those measurements with the decisions we take, but I think at the same time it can focus more as an evidence base of the success of the decisions we have taken, and I think that's where a lot of changes will take place in the future. And once we can clearly evidence that what we do is beneficial, then it may be easier to start thinking about compensations for that or understanding the benefits that will come in other ways to it. So people will have different opinions on that, and people here will have different opinions. I don't think that spending a lot of time in trying to calculate the economic benefits of all the services that soil has is going to advance us a lot. It ends up in an endless debate, and in the end, we haven't got the understanding, and I think we're better off focusing on that, but that's my opinion.
Any thoughts in the audience on how good it would be to have farmers incentivised for these sort of non-food producing things, or how practical it might be for us to do it? Anyone with a view on that? One thing that strikes me is that the process for claiming the single farm payment is complex enough already. I dread to think what DEFRA would come up with for people to fill in to make those sort of claims based on the amount of carbon they're sequestering into their fields. Someone here, you don't have to throw it very far there.
Oh, that's a shame.
It's quite good. I'm not very good at catching. So,
Could you say who you are? Sorry.
I'm Jack Cannon. I work at Cranfield University. It's an issue because soils, as Wilfred pointed out, there's 1,800 soil types in the UK. So naturally, each one of those will have different capacity to deliver those different services. So you can change the production function by adding water or nutrients, for example, but it's very difficult to try to do that for changing the capacity of that soil to absorb more water, for example. So yes, you can change the structure, but only to a certain amount. The same goes for carbon. Soils can only sequester a certain amount of carbon, and that will change depending on what soil type you have. So that really has to be a very, very complicated system where you have to tailor that particular benefit to a specific soil type and its ability to be able to do that function.
So I guess maybe that means that as our understanding of that grows and the extent to which different soil types are better or worse at achieving those aims, capturing carbon and so on, that maybe it may be the case that some farmers find they happen to have land that is particularly good at carbon capture, and so it's actually a waste for them to grow food. It's so good at carbon capture, they should focus their farm on doing that. That's an interesting idea for the future. Do you think that might come about?
Well, I don't know if we'll go that far, like farming butterflies and farming water, but certainly there are decisions to be made. Like we said, well, if what we want is store carbon in soils and we think it's more important than food, let's convert it to grassland and see whether or not we can. That may not work for every soil, like Jack pointed out, but at the moment, I think we've got very little knowledge about that. If we would want to make a change, what would be the best place to do it? I think whatever we demand from our soils, that's going to change. Whether our crop selection is going to change, some changes will happen. And the answer, like, what's the best place for that change to make? I don't think we've got the answer to those questions, and that's probably we should focus a little bit more upon, because at the moment we would look to solutions on site. We've got our sites are fixed. This is where we do our farming. We look at our decisions that are going to be there. What we don't look at, would there be a better place where we could do that if we completely radically redesign our landscape and had the potential to do that. We don't, but maybe we should think a bit more outside the box.
Now, you can hold on to the orange Smartie for the moment. I've got another question, but it's anonymous, so I don't know if it's even someone in the room here or someone from watching on the internet. But the question is, how do you think the UK holds up compared to the rest of the world in the way we look after our soil? So are we good compared to the rest of the world or bad in terms of the way in the UK, amongst UK farmers, we look after our soils?
I don't really know exactly the answer to that and what evidence I would be able to offer for that. But I've seen some data at some point, and I haven't got all those numbers in there, when you look at how much yield is changing within the UK. And we're not top at that. Now, there may be various reasons for that related to the potential of our soils. But when you think about it, that in the science area and the amount of knowledge we generate and therefore potentially can benefit, we ranked third in the world, just behind China and the US. So we're really up there in producing the knowledge and emphasizing the importance of soils. But it's also clear that that actually hasn't found a way in making sure that we have the best benefit within the UK. The reasons for that might be various. I'm not totally sure of that. But it does indicate there might be ways to improve this. But within the science development, I think the UK is very high up there. When it comes down to looking at soils, I'm not totally sure how to answer that, given the fact that the problems we have are so diverse all over the world. So we have different problems. In one place, we may be more interested in intensifying our production. In other areas, there's still scope to exploring more land or restoring land. But what I'm slightly concerned about is that our emphasis is on sustainable intensification. That's the buzz term we hear, and it's always a bit difficult to think what we do about that. But to me, it sounds a little bit like, well, the intensification we're going to get right. The sustainability is a little bit as a second target and an add-on in there. So the emphasis might not always be right, even already in the wording and the targets we chase. And the second aim with that is, well, sustainability. The area where we are, our soils are in decline. The potential is there to do so much more with them. So maybe we should be far more ambitious and actually really start thinking about how can we improve our soils, because that's where the long-term benefits are going to be made.
My perception certainly is that we're much more aware, even than 5 or 6 years ago, than we were. When you hear people talking about soil quality much more than you used to. Interesting at the Oxford Farming Conference, it's interesting that 7 or 8 years ago, when the Oxford Real Farming Conference started up, the topics being discussed at the two events were very different. You wouldn't really heard much about soil health at the Oxford Farming Conference. Now they seem to be becoming much more mainstream. So perhaps that's a positive sign that we're taking it more seriously. Do we have Cormac in the audience? We've got it. Right. Could you throw your board? Cormac, are you ready? I don't want it to hit you in the head.
Oh, well then.
Yeah, I suppose it's in the question really. And I know you've already addressed this before, but I really think like finding practical ways to finance this 4 per mil target, I think is the only way that it's going to really take off. And I'm just wondering, surrounding the discussions that were had at COP21, how much advancement has been made in that area? Because I think waiting for regulation will take quite a long time, whereas like if you manage to connect it to private monies somehow, that could take off quite a lot more quickly. I'm just wondering if you had anything to say on that.
Yeah, I'm interested that you threw the 4 per mil in there, because when I looked at what that 4 per mil actually means, they seem to be quite modestly increased in soil carbon. And I would have thought that the benefit of restoring and bringing more soil carbon into the soil to our yield are going to be sufficiently driver for us to go behind that. So that shouldn't really be a concern, I think. So I wouldn't really expect that actually needs a financial driver, but I'm intrigued that people seem to think that does. So I think there's one thing always looking like, well, if I do something, who's going to pay for it? But maybe also we should develop a different way of thinking and actually get that conviction and that belief that when we do this, it's going to be beneficial to my yield. And I don't necessarily always need to get money to do something because it's going to bring benefit to us. So soil organic carbon for me is an obvious one in there. And so I think the answer is I don't think the answer is in policies, and we should wait for policies to come in place that your hydraulic, your conductivity should be above these measures to secure that we've got less flooding in there and these sort of guidelines. I think the hydrology and the wetness in the soil have got a direct impact on farming anyway, and we should optimize our systems in that way. And the other benefits, I think, will come automatically because they're not interconnected. I think there are other benefits to society, but they all feed back. You saw all those arrows coming back. They all feed back into farming, and I think we should concentrate on the ones that optimize what we're really interested in, and that may shift, but if we can't do without our food. So if we keep on concentrating on that, but within the context of optimizing at the same time the other benefits, then I think that's a better route to go down. So yeah, the financial compensation for me isn't the driver, but I'm not a farmer, so it might be more interesting to hear the answer to that question from somebody else.
You're either all very shy or you don't want a ball thrown at your head, because there's lots of questions here, but they're all anonymous, so I don't know who to aim them at. So I'm going to ask a couple of these, but I can't ask you to ask them from the audience because they may not be in the audience. So, but while I'm asking these, perhaps if you want to resubmit some of the questions with your name on them, then we can get you to ask them from the floor. But there's a question here about the impact of pesticides. How much do we know, if anything, about the impact of pesticides on soil microbiology, or do we want to know about that?
Well, I think we know it's damaging to our diversity. We also know that very often it's damaging to some of the target organisms. So this is the area. I mean, we always say, well, we want to enhance biodiversity in soil, which is true. We just don't want all the pathogens to be enhanced and become more diverse in there as well. So I think what it exactly does, we don't know. Whether or not that should be our target, I don't know either. I think we need to enhance and retain our biodiversity, because we also know it's going to be good for crop. But I don't think we have that knowledge. I don't think we have the knowledge of the majority of our questions about what the impact is on any of those other surfaces in there, whether it's biodiversity, whether it is we're not very good in making those correlations yet and having that understanding. So we know that it's important. We know that soils have an impact on all those surfaces. So we know that soils are important, but we haven't got the solutions out there yet. We will have to decide what we're going to focus on with our questions. But for pesticides, it's obvious that we need more knowledge on there, because at the moment, I think we may take decisions on insufficient evidence base.
So by the sound of it at the moment, we're acting pretty blind. Do you feel it's realistic that in that sort of 2030 time frame, we'll know more, to be a bit more precise, a bit more, doing it with our eyes a bit more open than we are at the moment?
Well, I think we are, and I'm not totally sure if we're totally blind. I think we try things, but actually for me it would have been quite interesting when a lot of those technologies and management strategies which have been adopted, when the evidence base is not there, it's clear that those decisions have not been made based on evidence. So where did we take our knowledge from to take that decision? So actually I don't think we fully understand what makes people adopt new technologies, and that's almost a different discipline. So we can come up with all sort of solutions, but the adoption is not going to be automatically if we don't understand how that's going to be done. I probably have diverted from your question. What was the?
No, just how much more will we be sort of, with how much more insight will we be doing things like using pesticides and other inputs that we put in our crops in 20 years' time compared to now, when we don't really understand the overall impact of it. I mean, actually, it reminds me a bit of the sort of the gut bacteria that we have in our stomach, and we don't really understand the impact of the various sort of the antibiotics, things that we put in our own bodies, to those sort of that biodiversity in our guts.
Yeah, we still have to settle on what it is exactly we need to know. So there's a lot of biodiversity, and the biodiversity we may want to retain for various reasons, and we have got very little understanding still about what the function of that diversity would be. So we may need a better understanding of that, which will be developed over time. I've got no concerns about that, but they're not easy questions to address. So, yeah.
In your talk, there's a question here about the new facility that you're building at Cranfield.
Yeah,
you were talking about this,
yeah,
which sounds amazing, this sort of cubic meters of soil in very controlled environment, so we can separate out the effects of different things and study them in more detail.
Yeah.
How, is there scope for farmers to get involved in that? And if so, how can they do that? And when should they start telephoning you to say they want to get involved?
I think that opportunity is there, and in particular because, I mean, although those facilities are on Cranfield site, we don't own them, so they've been built for stakeholders in industry. So it is really for them to use it. There will be costs to using them, so it's get in touch. Get in touch with any of us in Cranfield, depending on the question, will put you in the right direction and can exploring how these questions can be addressed, either collectively or in any other ways. And it's good that you reminded me of that, because I think it also addresses the question you had previously about how we can provide a better evidence base, because when we go in the field, we've got all that variability in there, and we still identify some of the gaps. I showed you there with all those publications and knowledge that we have. We still haven't got the evidence base for a lot of things the way we do it. But what it does help us doing is identify where the uncertainties are. And now we have the opportunity, rather than collect more and more data and wait another 20 years, we can speed it up by actually targeting those problems, bring them into those systems in a controlled way, not just a single solution, but we can assess them within different climate conditions and different crops, different crop rotations. So within more realistic settings, to really study the long-term impact on that and get a quicker answer to those questions. So I think it's not that we can't answer them, it's just because it's so heterogeneous, the environment, that if we keep on collecting it in the environment, it's so difficult to distract the information from it. So there's not one answer to it. It's going up in a more controlled way, as well as finding different ways of digesting the knowledge that's out there.
We're getting a bit tight on time, and I'm very aware that you don't just want to hear my voice, so I'm very keen to get some questions from the audience. Because I don't know who's asked a lot of these, I'm just going to ask you to put your hand up. If you've asked a question or you want to ask a question, do you want to just put your hand up and we'll hurl the ball at you? Down the front here, the ball's at the back, isn't it? Can you pass it forward? Thank you.
So it's Peter Gadd, actual practitioner and farmer some of the time. Professor, as a practitioner, we're in the here and now, and we have to run, as land managers in this country, sustainable businesses financially, as well as practically on the farm. And that means looking after the soil, of course. But can you give us a couple or three take-home messages that we can actually go home and employ in the next 5 or 10 years to help the cause of our soil health? And I guess that means measuring certain parameters. But maybe you'd like to expand on just 1 or 2 key take-home messages.
Well, I think if you go back to the part of the talk, there were the strategies in there already that we know work. So if you want to have some improvement on your soil health, these are the options that we have the evidence for at the moment that will help you. Of course, I don't know what's already in place and what sort of system you have, so I don't think there's a global answer to that, like do this, but cover crops are going to be, but most people will already be doing that. Where we can improve on that is that understanding better what the problems are on there and make a better selection of the solutions that we have and tailor it better. So more understanding of the problems or the problem areas that there would be on the farm would be a way to go forward. I think also within the next 5 years, we will be able to obtain far more measurements and details of what's happening in the farm, which will help you to assess where your problems are and which direction you are traveling. Because it's one thing to know what your conditions are, that doesn't tell us yet in which direction you're traveling and where the corrections are required. So these are the areas where I think some more immediate assistance can come from. I understand your question, and I think that's the struggle that we have, I think, because you're right, you've got immediate problems and they require immediate solutions. You can probably give me one problem, somebody else will give me another problem, and we'll be chasing problems. And most of those problems we might be able to resolve. We might create another problem in a way because we didn't understand our system. But I agree that some of the collective problems that exist, like we know compaction is a problem, so there are the sort of grand problems and the grand challenges that we can focus on and bring improvements to. So we can target our efforts probably not towards an individual problem, but a more collective problem and bring solutions for that. But if we continuously change or chase after problems, I think we'll lose out on what potentially can offer us a big step change. So I think we need to have the two approaches in there. And this, I think, is the sort of balance that we need to have between applied science and fundamental science. And I think we can't go in one way. As much as I think people that have immediate problem would like us to push all in that way and help solve the problems, I think we also need to keep our focus on the longer term possibilities, because that's where I think the bigger changes are going to be made. But these are the balances between individual interest and societal interest. Some decisions you take on the farm may be good for the farm, but it may not good at the larger scale. And maybe I think these sort of aspects will be taken place into the decision taking of what will be done at an individual level.
So just to remind you, there was a slide earlier where the panel of experts were asked to assess a whole range of different approaches and assess, based on the evidence, which looked like they'd work the best. And the three that were in that sphere of beneficial without big negative effects were grow cover crops, use better crop rotations, and amend the soil using integrated nutrient management. So that panel's assessment was those three all have pretty good benefits. They're well understood and not so many negatives. So perhaps they're three takeaways. Although I guess it does depend a lot on the nature of the soil and the issues you've got in it, so it's hard to give an overall answer. I think we might have to make this the last question. I've got two hands up, so let's squeeze both of them in. Do you want to just pass the ball back? And then there's one just behind you as well.
Now then, Graham Potter. Just a quick one, really. Have you done any work with slugs?
Quick answer, no.
Thank you. I was just wondering, because, I mean, on our farm, we do everything that we can. We cover crops, we control traffic, trying to do everything we can to build our organic matter up in the soils. And our biggest problem is slugs, and trying to combat those things. And, you know, you're doing all this research here, and I didn't know whether you had any, you'd done anything with the slugs.
Nope.
Obviously, big problem.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there are other problems out there, and of course I focused my talk a bit on the soil, but I totally agree, it's not an isolated system. As complex as the soil system is, it's part of the larger society and larger problems. And what we do below ground, what we would target, is going to affect also what we have above ground. So there are other problems, and we will have to keep an eye on that. So I haven't worked on that. I'm sure somebody else will have worked on that and may be able to assist with that, and it is not a problem, I think, which we can't address. So it may just something which I'm not aware of that somebody's.
But Graham, that does give me an opportunity to plug the next lecture in this series, which is on biocontrols, and I'm sure there are some bio opportunities to control slugs. Can we just take the last question behind there?
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking presentation. Tudor Dawkins from ProCam. I'd like to just ask you, is there a prioritisation process for these projects? Is there a review of looking at not just the benefits, not just the consensus on what are problems, but for the UK as such? Is there one priority that you can identify that the work you're ultimately going to produce could actually help in the short term?
I can't personally, because I haven't had that focus in my area, so I wouldn't be the most appropriate person to answer that question, I'm afraid. So it's really like within the UK. I mean, that study that I put forward wasn't simply targeted at the UK. So I think it was a first study that I came in, and it was a recent one, so I like that. It's not the only way by which we can do that, and it probably provokes more questions than answers, and it can be followed up if we believe, well, this is a way of doing it. I mean, you come up now with some other questions. This was a panel which put these questions together. It wasn't my study. It's like I said, well, I read it and I was interested, so I thought I'll share that with you because I like the philosophy of the approach behind it. Not necessarily that the way it was done was okay. I don't think the panel was big enough. So the number of opinions in there will have been too limited to get a comprehensive overview. But I like the philosophy behind that when we review an area, we actually do that in context with some stakeholders, in the context of some practical solutions that can be brought, and that the evaluation is done collectively as well. So more a shared ownership of our conclusions. And that will guide our knowledge gaps, and it will guide our ways forward. And that, again, can be done in a collective way. So I think there's going to be increased ways of doing this. So I think also because the amount of knowledge that we produce is increasing at such a phenomenal rate that, like I said, well, we can't read the papers anymore. So why are we writing them, you can always ask. And I think that there's going to be different ways by which we will assess the knowledge. So the system is so complex, and like I said, we will not get one answer anymore. So if I do this, you will get probably, even when we build a model, you'll get a phenomenal amount of data coming out of that, and you won't be able to assess that in the sort of traditional way. I didn't step on it, but I think this is the sort of area where visualization and computer gaming can come back in, because there's a lot of work going on at the moment in the sort of complex systems where all the knowledge and the models run on the background and you don't see it. But as a stakeholder, you can interact with it in a way visually, and that will help us to see, well, how can we really communicate that way visually in the best way. So it may be that you will, in time, look at a computer screen and say, what happens if I start doing this? And all the programs, all our knowledge is running on the background. You don't have to worry about that. Visually, you'll be able to see at a landscape how this is going to be done. So I think the way we will digest the knowledge and communicate that is one of the things that is going to change and will have to change, because quite frankly, we can't cope with what's being out there at the moment, whether it's right or wrong. That's, for every answer that you'll find another 10 telling you the opposite. So
I'm afraid we're going to have to draw questions to a close now before we move on to the final part of the evening. So I just want to ask you all once again to give a round of applause to Professor Otten for the lecture tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
You just need to be patient for literally 2 minutes. So if you could just stay in your seats, we just need to reset the stage very briefly, and we're going to hear how Syngenta soil science experts are working on the research they're doing that could help farmers tackle some of the current problems. So if you just wait for 2 minutes while we reset the stage, and then we'll hear from Syngenta. And for those of you in the room here after that, we'll adjourn to the next room and have something to eat. I'm afraid those of you watching on the internet, hopefully you've got your own food there somewhere. You can't join us for food. But those of you in the room here, Professor Otten will be there joining us for dinner, so you can ask some of your further questions there after the lecture. So just be patient for 2 minutes, and then we'll be back with Syngenta. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks everybody for hanging around. I think the incentive of something to eat has obviously done the trick. What a tough act to follow. And a comment I would say in the current times is, isn't it great that we've got such expertise in the UK driving such great science forward? So what I would like to do in a brief slot is touch upon Syngenta's role with soil science. And I've tried to frame it in the why, what, and where next format. My name's Robin Oliver, and I work in the product safety part of Syngenta, and previously tried to integrate our soil science efforts across the organisation. And I think Wilfred touches on a key point there, that how we get the collective community from the academics to the translational organisations to the growers and all the other stakeholders lined up to make these changes is the real challenge. The science is brilliant, industry can translate, growers can implement, it's just doing it all together. So I've already tipped my hand, I don't need the slides. It's on here. Okay, so a little bit about Syngenta. We are a global organisation, and that will come across in some of my slides. And just to put the scale of the challenge globally into a little bit of perspective, 8 million large-scale farms, 450 million smallholders. And Syngenta as an organisation touches a great deal of these. So as a translational vehicle, we can do a great deal to take some of that great science and get it into these farms. But let's go back to some of the challenge. We've talked a great deal tonight about sustainability, and I will come back to sustainability. But the global population is growing, it's a fact. And one of the things that kind of struck me, I originally did this slide, or doctored this slide, because it's from the corporate deck. When it was originally made just a couple of years ago, that population at 2050 was 9 billion. I checked the most recent figures, it's 9.7. So even the estimates are still, the best estimates of population rise are continuing to increase. Combined with that, we shouldn't forget that the world is actually getting wealthier, and that drives a great deal of agricultural demand. People are not going to settle for impoverished diets. They want what we all in this room have, and why not? Clearly, that's going to drive demand significantly. But in many developed nations, our self-sufficiency in food production is actually declining. All of which raises the question, getting ahead of myself. In other parts of the world, production is booming. Environmental stresses, as we heard at great length, are increasing, and we certainly can't ignore those. So it all comes to the question of, are developed nations, the UK amongst them, increasingly outsourcing their environmental problems? It's a fair question, a fair challenge. And all of that is a prelude to where a lot of our activities get framed, which is in the space of sustainable intensification. And I think Wilfred made a very good point that we absolutely have to put the sustainable into the intensification, but we do need both. It is clearly a global challenge. And we can't continue to rely on being able to go down to the supermarket and have the world's agricultural output all at our behest, because as the rest of the world gets wealthier, there will be increasing competition for all of those exotic fruits and lovely things that we like. So we have to play our part and pull our weight in both sides of this equation. I think the thing that we also have to remember, and we've talked a lot about it and clearly struggled for clear answers, is that sustainability is predicated on improving grower incomes. So there has to be something in it for the grower. There has to be whether that's improved yield that can be sold into the global markets, or whether that's through government subsidies that are aligned with metrics that we can collectively design to do a better job than perhaps we do today. Clearly, in order for sustainability to be enacted at the field scale, there has to be something in it for the growers. Now, I won't dwell on this, but Wilfred laid it out very, very clearly. Soil degradation is clearly a threat to sustainability. So we're going to start focusing a little bit on soil now. And I always think, well, it's the classic quote, isn't it? Picture's worth 1,000 words. It's a real problem. It's not a made-up problem. It comes in many forms. And I particularly like this picture at the bottom. I've termed it biodiversity because these seagulls that are following the tractor, that's what's happened to the biodiversity in that field. So I'll pick up on one of the other questions that was asked about pesticides and the impact on microbes. Yes, they have an impact on microbes. Some are degraded by microbes, so they actually act as a substrate and you get an increase in microbes. Are they good microbes or bad microbes? Is there such a thing? Who knows? But in terms of the scale of the effect, how does really, compared to putting a plough through a field or climate change or even putting a different crop in succession, probably has a bigger impact and a longer lasting impact on microbial biodiversity than any crop protection products that go in. So Syngenta's areas of interest are sustainability, optimising the safety and effectiveness of crop protection products, and the below-ground contribution to yield. So in order to translate that great academic science, we work in partnership with a great number of academics in the UK and around the world. So I've picked out a few here, and I've tried to kind of convey the fact that we partner across those academic scales, from soil microbiology to this incredible technology that enables us to see things in 3D, and indeed increasingly in 3D in real time. How fantastic is that? When you can see your roots disappearing into a nematode in real time, that's what you want. I'll come on to a little bit of where I think some of the additional translational opportunities lie, building on what Wilfred said earlier. And then we work with, at the semi-field scale and at the field scale, with partners to really try and understand how we can make sustainability a reality and make it economically viable for our customers. One thing I just wanted to highlight is the soil security programme, because I think for the first time actually there is an umbrella that's starting to pull together all of that diverse sustainability research together to give it a coherent identity and to harness the influencing power of that academic community to influence industry and to influence government and ultimately growers. So I think our interest in sustainability can be summed up in these questions here. We want to understand why practices have to change. So I think in some ways it's a fairly obvious question when you see the pictures earlier on in the soil, but where you don't have those so obvious impacts on soil, why change practices? They've been successful, they've worked, they've produced food, people know them, love them, so why change practices? What's the evidence that practice needs to change? Clearly we're interested in making sure that water is protected and that bees, pollinators, other elements of biodiversity are protected. We want to understand the benefits of these systems beyond just yield. So in the sustainability space, this is an example, and I hope the builds work here, of some of our current activities. These are plots on a 10% slope in Hungary on a silty soil, and there's conventional till, with green cover, conservation till without green cover. See, some of these should be plus and minus. Sorry, that's my mistake. So at the moment, the green cover work is in an early stage, but the metrics that we're looking at here try to cover those things I touched on earlier on. So yield and quality, the costs of the inputs, do they go up, do they go down, impact on fertilizer use, and of course, impact on crop protection, efficacy. You change the way you farm, sometimes that has an impact on the efficacy of crop protection and indeed the need for it. So to give some of the results here, if you look at the graphs, we have conventional without buffer, and you can see for runoff, unsurprisingly, you get most runoff of the soil in that system. Conventional plus a buffer reduces it. But if you look at the two conservation systems, completely stops the runoff off the field. A similar trend with erosion and with pesticide runoff. So clearly, conservation tillage brings a number of benefits in that sustainability space, and clearly to the wider environment in terms of keeping products on the field and keeping soil on the field. That's an important thing. Now, the one thing I didn't have time to add into this slide is actually the background to this is that initially when these systems were implemented, there was a dip in yield for the first couple of years. But as the farmers that were adopting these approaches learned and understood and how to manage the crop in that context better, and I think it comes back to Wilfred's point about there is a learning process around complex systems, the yield started to increase again. So we've touched on the kind of European context. I just want to say a little bit about the context of the wider world. Syngenta is engaged with all those with growers around the world, and actually in some ways it's a more achievable challenge to make a significant difference in less intensive systems, smallholder systems, because we can actually do that by integrating advice on cultivation techniques and technologies that help both yield and sustainability in that context. It's a slightly more complex challenge in a European context, but it's important to remember that there's a big challenge out there in the rest of the world, and we, I think like everybody in the room, are trying to work out just exactly, what the optimal solutions are in different scales and different contexts. So Wilfred already touched on this in terms of where next for sustainability. It really is about unlocking the potential of the rhizosphere, soil structure, microbiology to optimize yield, biodiversity, and reduce vulnerability. And one of the things I personally think has a huge future in that space is modelling. Yeah, putting a lot of these things in silico enables us to take complex systems and integrate them across scales, and I think that's an area where we can and should see a lot of progress in the future. And I think, as well as the practical semi-field scale approaches that Wilfred talked about, being able to almost have that sandbox, if you could make it a game, as Wilfred was suggesting, wouldn't that be fantastic if you could, optimize your farm in the virtual world? So I touched a little bit earlier on crop protection. We traditionally think of crop protection as chemicals, and chemicals still play a large part in crop protection. But increasingly, biologicals are used, genetics, both natural traits and genetically modified traits, and mechanical approaches are also used. Everything from cultivation techniques to, if you like, lasers perhaps, or recently some things I've seen on the use of UV light to control fungal diseases in the field. Now, soil has a large part to play in the effectiveness of many of these forms of crop protection. And crop protection, in turn, has a part to play in sustainable intensification. And it's, again, I don't think it's, for me, taking it too far to say that there are many aspects of farming practice that have potentially a much bigger impact on biodiversity or soil microbial biodiversity than crop protection. So one of the things we are keen to do is actually design in more characteristics into the crop protection products that we develop that make them more regulatorily palatable. I don't want to use the word safe, because in many cases they are generally safe. It's a regulatory question and a regulatory challenge that has to be passed. Now, again, in silico modelling has a great place to play in this space, because in this example, and I think we've probably missed the highlight, what you could see early on was the movement of the crop protection product, and the kind of inverted triangle is the root space. So in this particular, what this enables us to do is you move away from just taking a number in a table and thinking, well, I think that product will be mobile or it won't be mobile, and it enables you to understand and visualize how much of the root system it will protect, how long it will be there, whether that time of protection will cover the time when your pest is going to be targeting those roots, whether your compound will subsequently dissipate where it is or whether it will move. And you can do that, so that enables us to take many, many analogues, measure the properties, model them in silico, and identify those that have got that perfect combination of properties where they protect the root system for the length of time they need to for the pest you're trying to manage, but they then dissipate after that time frame. So, great technology. And I think the challenge is putting all of those strands of technology together. So, in order to build those models, you have to understand how the chemistry behaves, how it interacts with the soil, all those complex facets of the soil, the physical matrix. You need to understand the life cycle of the target pest. You need to understand the life cycle of the non-target pests. But we can do that. We've already done it for some, and we can put that into in silico models, and we can use that sandbox to identify products, be they chemical, be they biological. Indeed, we can model the influence of mechanical treatments in such a way. So fantastic technology to enable us to design those products of the future that will play their part in sustainable intensification. And the final area of interest, and this is an emerging one for us, and I think it's reflected in much of the complexity that we've heard tonight. How do we optimize the soil microbiome? Does that come naturally through a healthier soil, a soil with more organic matter, a more diverse microbial community? I don't know the answer to that. Or does it need a helping hand? You know, there are inocula in the literature where people have identified communities of microbes that they've inoculated the soil with and seen a yield benefit from. So it's the kind of natural man-made argument in miniature, literally. And then the other element of the below-ground yield question around biotic and abiotic stress. So how can we, what root architecture makes a difference? What root architecture will promote good crop yield but reduce soil vulnerability? Because of course roots play a big part in soil retention on fields. And I think to frame the question, we really should be looking to tackle that complexity. Why can't we have both? Why can't we have everything? Why can't we have sustainability, intensification, and, you know, a good income for the people that manage that land? I don't see any reason why we shouldn't. That should be our ambition, and we should be ambitious. So, final slide. We recognised long ago that there are many more great scientists and great professionals outside Syngenta than there are inside Syngenta. So we work in partnership, always open to suggestions, open to ideas. So if you have any, just like Wilfred, get in touch. I hope I managed that in 20 minutes. How did I do for time, folks?
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you everyone for coming. Those of you watching at home, thank you very much for joining in. Just to remind you, this is the second in the series of the Farmers Weekly Syngenta Arable Horizons lectures. The next one is on biocontrols. It's on the 9th of March. If you're interested in going to that or any of the other lectures in the series, then just the easiest thing is to just Google Farmers Weekly Arable Horizons and it'll come top of the list and you'll find it. So thanks again for coming. For those of you in the room, food is now being served out the back. Professor Otten and Robin will be here, I think, joining us for the food. So if you've got more questions for them, you can quiz them over their food. Do let them eat, though. Thanks again. Good night.